the overall kind of tension between AI policy or within the AI community is one between guardrails and AI safety, and one of innovation and continued development without regulation.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Centre. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. It seems that more and more in the context of the US election, we are hearing about cyber issues. From Iran's hack of the Trump campaign to Taylor Swift deepfakes, technology seems to be posing a more overt threat. At the same time, it is unlocking new opportunities for innovation, economic growth, and even record-breaking campaign strategies. How have we seen technology affect the U.S. presidential election this year? Where are Trump and Harris campaigns on technology adoption and policy? What will the future of campaigning look like in this new technological age? To answer these questions, I'm happy to welcome Helen Zhang on the USSC Briefing Room. Helen is a non-resident fellow at the USSC and an expert on emerging technology and national security policy. Helen co-founded the popular international relations media organization International Intrigue, who run their own podcasts, and is a former Googler and ex-diplomat with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Welcome to the podcast, Helen.
Thank you, Mari. Thank you for having me here.
And at the end of the episode, we will get you by the numbers stat on this topic, so I'm looking forward to hearing that.
Oh, okay. Being put on notice.
So now you recently visited Australia, and you're originally from here, but you're working in the States at the moment. I know you had a pretty packed agenda while you were here, but I'm keen to know, where are you seeing either the most convergence or divergence of ideas between the US and Australia and technology issues?
Sure. I think that's a great question to start with, Mary. I think, obviously the US being one is just a much, much bigger market. And so therefore, I think what I saw while I was back is that a lot of the conversations that were being had in Australia was very different to the ones that I'm hearing in the US. So what I mean by that is in Australia, I've heard a lot of people talk about, cyber, as you open this with cyber and talking about cybersecurity, fraud and sort of cyber crimes. Whereas I think the conversation in the US within sort of the tech community has really moved beyond regulating tech. So in addition to sort of understanding, yes, we need to regulate tech, they're talking about, how to fund the next Internet 3.0 with agentic AI and the sort of future of, artificial generative intelligence, rather than talking about sort of Internet 2.0. So I don't necessarily mean that this conversation is not happening in Australia, but I think that if we're talking about sort of the Internet, I think a lot of the conversations in the US are more centered about on sort of funding the next thing that's about to come around the corner. Whereas I think in Australia, we're still very much tied down to thinking about legislating 2.0 with the Internet 2.0. So for example, thinking about online harms, thinking about sort of the how the Internet is shaping the market and ensuring that there's fair play and fair trade. But separate to that, I think in the US, the conversation around tech is also into defense tech, right? And thinking about how to fund defense tech and dual use technology. Now, I know there's that conversation happening here in Australia as well. And maybe that's, to answer your question, maybe that's where things converge a little bit. But I think everybody across the board has their eyes on sort of, AI and what society is going to do about AI.
Oh, and this is something that we've talked about on the podcast a bit, both in terms of tech broadly, but in the realm of defense tech, thinking about R&D and the Valley of Death, how we're taking technology and then commercializing it or fueling that innovation to happen. So if it sounds like you're saying in the US space, because there's so much innovation happening, or thinking about really the future in the Internet 3.0 and all of that. Does it feel like in the US, they've got a good ecosystem figured out for turning the innovations into reality, the ideas, and like kind of funding them and making them become a thing? Or does that feel like it's a bit fraught and tense, or has issues that need to get worked out?
Yeah, great questions, Mary. I mean, I think, look, to answer that question, it's US has always been very good at commercializing their technology in a way that I think Australia has struggled because we are just a much smaller market, right? I think to put things in perspective, Australia's population is smaller than that of California, right? So California is I think almost 40 million people, whereas Australia is close to 26, 27 million. So it's just a very different, scale that we're talking about. But I think what I referenced earlier, what I meant by that is that, this is a time, 2024 right now, we're seeing defense tech and sort of Silicon Valley play a bigger role in defense tech than we've ever seen. I think for years and years, there were a lot of people trying to get sort of Silicon Valley to sort of invest in defense tech, but that moment has never come because it's never been seen to be something that was sexy or necessary or lucrative, to be frank. But what we've seen since the Ukraine invasion and, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, things have changed, right? And I think our world has changed more in the last 2 to 3 years than it has in the last 30 years. And that is very much reflected, I think, in the defense tech space. So we're really seeing that here in the US right now. And that's, I think, really been unprecedented, at least in sort of my lifetime.
Yeah. And one thing I want to think about is because this is, we're in another election year, which is a huge focus for Australians. I mean, they pay so much attention to the US presidential election. In 2020, the most Googled term by Australians was the US presidential election. And in 2020, that means the number 2 term was COVID. So COVID was Googled second, and the U.S. election was Googled first. So it's front of mind for Australians. And there's just this trend we're seeing of the role that like different technology threats might play in these elections. So I remember 2016, we learned about the Russian interference with the U.S. election through technology, especially social media in particular. There was the famous WikiLeaks dump, and then that which may have had some impact on the election outcome. And then the trend around disinformation in 2020 seemed to hit a fever pitch because it wasn't, that campaign was run in the context of COVID, so there was like COVID disinformation going on. There was election disinformation. In 2024. What are the major issues where you think technology is impacting the presidential campaign that we're seeing?
I think this is a really interesting time. You've done you're almost doing my job for me, Mara. You've outlined the sort of like chronology of human beings and sort of our society's exposure to information integrity or misintegrity, right? So whether that's misinformation or disinformation, which is used to on purpose, intentionally to sow false information. So I think as we've seen now in the sort of evolution, the societies, and I'm talking about Western societies here, democratic societies, which have been sort of, which are vulnerable to information misintegrity, they've become more inoculated, right? Whether that is through sort of a sort of downwards push from the authorities saying, hey, you need to learn more about disinformation, misinformation, or whether that is like from a ground up sort of education campaign. And I think folks themselves since sort of 2016 has become a lot more, almost 10 years past 2016, right? Almost, it's hard to believe that it's almost 10 years since then. So I think if you think about it that way, sort of the gravity of the disinformation that initially that we had been sort of that pervaded the 2016 campaigns are no longer as effective. Now, that said, big tech is playing their role, civil society is playing their role, government's playing their role. I think there are still a lot of folks who are subject to a thing that I think is really interesting, which is the disinformation coming at the electoral sort of process towards the process at which they go to the ballot booths. So I think the process of the election campaign itself is kind of where we're seeing disinformation targeting. So for example, telling a group of voters, hey, the election is off, we're not going today, so it's the next day, or hey, this bus is no longer running, so you have to get a different method of transport. And of course, we're seeing the regular kind of cheap fake stuff, and also the actual deep fakes. But the difference is, I think, compared to 2020 and 2016, is that there's now some criminal charges or sort of at least fines slapped to bad actors who try and do that. So I think disinformation is now clearly sort of in the legislative space where people have policies and governments are trying to crack down on disinformation. I think one thing that's really interesting, and I had mentioned this in my talk at Sydney University earlier this year, is that we heard a lot about 2024 being the big year where disinformation and AI is really going to take over democracy. And so far, I don't think we've seen the worst of what was expected just yet. And I think about the Indian elections, which is a really big one this year that despite a lot of the flag that it was going to be a big note of disinformation, we've only seen two areas where there were disinformations that I thought were problematic. One was, where AI generated content is going through sort of low grade sort of key nodes of influence that can appeal to emotions. And the second is that distributed through unmoderated and unscrutinized platforms that are kind of packaged by hyper-local content aggregators. So I don't think we've seen that just yet in the US and in most sort of electoral circles. And also the US population has generally been a little bit more inoculated towards disinformation. I know I'm going to say this podcast is going to air and then something's going to happen which is going to prove me all wrong.
That's always the way, isn't it? Yeah, that's always how it goes.
Exactly. That's right. But, I think the AI, these cues that we're looking for, one thing that I think is probably not a great note to leave on, but is something to consider is that the initial cues that we were trained to look for in an AI-generated image, like, for example, someone's got 6 fingers or somebody's got like eyeballs looking the wrong way. These AI has now become so sophisticated that I think detection and provenance is now much more difficult. And so, there are lots of subtle things that can be done for AI, which means that just because the dog hasn't really barked yet, it doesn't mean that it won't. And it doesn't mean that the impacts of it won't be widespread. So I think definitely it's something to watch, but I think that we are in a better place generally than 2016 and 2020 in the US.
Yeah, well, as you were talking, I was thinking about, the AI image generation, which has changed radically. I think when the 2020 election happened, I wouldn't have imagined the just how easy it was that anyone would have access to these AI platforms and could type in some prompts and then get an image generated. I did not think that would be a thing. And so I think, in terms of my personal journey, like I was initially, when I would see these images, you're just kind of blown away, like, oh my goodness. In a few seconds, it took this prompt and now it has created this thing. Oh my goodness. But then after you do it a little bit, you're like, oh wait, that is so weird, or that person has no eyes, or what you start to notice those things. So I was starting to feel a bit more comfortable with, okay, I might be able to tell when these images are fake, and then because sometimes I'm not necessarily noticing it because when I see an image, I'm not scanning the details.
And I think this is, one of the best examples of this, of AI being more sophisticated, is the recent assassination attempt on President Trump earlier this year, where the Secret Service agent was actually docked to be smiling as opposed to sort of, photo of Trump being caught. He was, the Secret Service agent was manipulated so it looked like they were smiling rather than frowning at what was happening.
Yeah.
So it's in little subtle things like that I think it can have a really big impact event.
Yeah, and the fact that it can change so rapidly, like, yes, there's these weird things happening with human fingers and faces in the AI images, but just as the leap that we've seen from what we could do in 2020 to now what we can do in 2024, you're right. It's that the ability to pick and spot the fakes is going to get a lot harder. So I wonder, what's going to happen. So, but hopefully, hopefully there will be new detection methods, or we'll just get trained, or something will happen that we'll get better at it. And I know some places have started to regulate, what is and isn't allowed in terms of those images that are generated. So there'll be a regulatory aspect as well. But I guess it's not all doom and gloom, because in the world of technology, because there are some, new capacities, new abilities that we're having now that were never available before. It's been really interesting to see that since Kamala Harris replaced Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, she has then pivoted the way of doing a lot of things, including these Zoom fundraisers, taking advantage of this technology that's there and make it a new thing. And then she's setting these fundraising records in the process. How, looking at the different campaigns we've seen this year, how are we seeing them adopt different technology this year, and has it been effective? I mean, I talked about Kamala Harris and the Zoom fundraisers, but are there other examples of where we're seeing technology this year?
I think fundamentally using technology as a tool to promote their messages has not necessarily changed. I think both sides have, um, gotten onto the handheld devices, understand that pushing out their content through sort of social media as well as other content hosting platforms is super important, right? And I don't think that's necessarily being the game changer compared to 2020. But I think what is, potentially a game changer is how both campaigns are going to think about their tech policies, right? And we can go into that question later on. But I think what's important to note is that these trends that we've been seeing sort of post-COVID of, thinking about how to engage with their voters who are in so-called walled gardens of information. So, for example, how do you engage with folks who are not on the mainstream social media, things like Twitter or X or Meta and Facebook, and what other sort of TikTok or even other sort of social media platforms. How do you engage with those walled gardens? For example, going on to Signal or going on to Telegram and places where I think traditionally, I think the Republicans have done a better job at communicating with that. And of course, I have to mention President Trump's Truth Social. I think that's also gotten certainly a vocal part of the Republican voters as well. And I think both campaigns have done a really solid job of engaging with those voters through those platforms. So whether that's through TikTok, Reels, particularly I think, Harris's campaign has done a really interesting job at engaging the Gen Z millennial voters. And then as for, the traditional kind of door knocking and all the rest, that's still there, I think, but they've both been able to use technology platforms to be able to mobilize their base, right? Or try as much as possible to mobilize their base, which I think, as an American is critical to getting turnout on the day, which is critical to then getting election results and wins. But I think what's been interesting for political analysts in sort of looking at the way that both campaigns are running is having this extraordinary amount of data now to be able to crunch, right? To be able to get better results outside of sort of polling. And I think we all know you can't overly trust polling based on the 2016 results, but I do think that there are a lot more sophisticated ways and interesting businesses out there and consultants out there who are crunching data to show us, where exactly the trend lines are and what's happening in each state and each county and sort of at the sort of more tactical level.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because something like technology doesn't just because a campaign is using technology doesn't inherently mean it's going to be effective. I think about when President Biden went on TikTok and ran his first video during the Super Bowl, but then President Trump was on TikTok as well. And, Biden was on there for a few months, but he only ever had a fraction of the followers that President Trump had on TikTok, and just a tiny amount of the engagement comparatively. So they're on the same platform, which is the same kind of sort of content where it's these short form videos, but one candidate had far, far more success on that platform than the other. So it's not just about using it, but it's, I guess, how you do it, how effective it is. And it comes down to your messaging, your audience, a whole bunch of different things. It seems like President Trump was able to tap into something that worked much better with the algorithm in that case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he probably was a more compelling, if I can say that, as a principle as well. And I think, President Biden, I think sort of his team has since pivoted, obviously. And I think and sort of VP Harris has now also done a great job at kind of engaging with that next gen. The whole Brat Summer and all the sort of, pop culture references has been really helpful for her campaign to kind of catapult her back into that spotlight.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned is where the role of the next administration on big tech, which will be really interesting to see where they land on their policies. And we can, because the space is evolving so quickly, so it'll be a critical role for the next administration. And then the decisions they make or the regulations they support, the laws that get passed, is something where we will see some changes that'll shift the trajectory and momentum around that. Do you think we'll see a different approach to big tech based on who wins the election? And what things do you think will stay the same regardless of who wins, and what things do you think might be different?
The short answer is, Mary, I do. I think that there is going to be a difference between the two administrations, but of course, time will tell because, as we say in DC, the personnel is the policy, and we're not exactly sure who the personnel are going to be yet in those key tech positions. I think President Trump had one time floated Elon Musk as one of the people who'd be shaping that policy. So I imagine sort of that version of whatever the tech landscape, regulatory landscape will look vastly different to perhaps, the Democratic side. I think one thing that's going to be very sort of, the key things that maybe we can talk about here are the fact that tech is increasingly going to be more geopolitical. And I think that this is something that has already kind of come through in the last couple of elections. And I think that's going to be even more the case for this coming election. The second thing that I think will remain the same is that, obviously tech is going to be more complex. So they're going to continue to try and legislate on tech across different verticals, whether that's to do with energy, whether that's to do with the future of supply chains. But it is increasingly sort of a domestic industry agenda. And I think the third thing is, of course, the rise of Silicon Valley and defense tech that I think I've mentioned earlier that we can talk to as well. But, the key thing that, and then, of course, China being the key kind of competitor for both sides. The one thing that I think both sides have not really kind of clearly articulated and will be different is their approaches to AI safety and guardrails. So whether that's regulatory controls, whether that's to do with innovation, what AI safety means as a definition, I think all of those things will be different. I think on the Trump side, the AI conversations are probably, they're less keen to talk about AI safety than they were probably since the last Trump administration, because I think there is a perception that the current AI sort of ecosystem is pushing quote unquote radical left ideas. And so with that in mind, I think the Trump side is probably going to be, Republicans are probably going to be pushing more towards open models and this idea of AI safety, or debunking this idea of AI safety and ensuring that there's not political agendas being built into large language models. And then I think on the Harris side, a lot of people say this, but she is a darling of the Californian big tech industry. And so as a result, I think she's had a really strong reputation there and is very consultative and has been very consultative on big tech. So I think if we're thinking about things that are different to what they're currently doing, I think, Harris will probably push for policies that are probably not in favor of big tech, but trying to sort of work with them to enact legislation like a federal privacy legislation and other things that have been on the back burner for a long time. So this is it's a really interesting space to watch because obviously now tech touches on every facet of sort of domestic policy as well to a certain extent. So whoever they get into those key positions will be very telling in terms of the future of tech policy in the US and globally.
And I think the key figures in big tech that's a space where it has shifted pretty dramatically over the last 4 years. Like if we think of, the Silicon Valley tech bros, typically we've thought of them as more, left-leaning, liberal agenda. I mean, it's the California side of things as well. But this time around, we've got Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, was a venture capitalist who's got close ties with Peter Thiel. And we've got people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and, questions around Mark Zuckerberg as well, like these big kind of tech titans, either overtly, either overtly supporting the Trump campaign or kind of tipping their hat one way, or at least not saying, okay, no, we're on the Democratic side of politics, which seems to be a shift in that ecosystem. Is there a reason that you think we're seeing them more and more move toward the right-wing side of politics, and will that shift change anything?
The reason why we're seeing it is because the overall kind of tension between AI policy or within the AI community is one between guardrails and AI safety, and
Oh,
one of innovation and continued development without regulation.
yeah.
So I think for a lot of folks who are in the VC space, removing their ideological views, I think if they're thinking about pushing more and having more sort of investments in AI and businesses in AI, and seeing AI develop as technology, they would want to have innovation not hampered
Yeah.
by regulation. So I think that has been sort of the key differentiator. And of course, I think we're being very transactional here and very blunt. I think there's a lot of money in AI,
Yep.
and anyone who is working in that industry would probably not want to see that. That the sort of flow of funding stopped there. But I will
Oh,
say, just to push back on that, Mari, I think there's been a lot of VCs for Harrods as well. I think there's
yeah.
actually a web page that's been published with a lot of their names, pushing for sort of AI safety and AI guardrails, and thinking about what the future of AI development and what AI models should look like. Should, these questions of AI algorithmic bias, questions of should we have an open source large
Oh,
language models, or should we, or should have a closed one using China and everything else that's going on with the broader US-China competition, great power competition. There's a lot of questions there as well. And then, of course, going to sort of the broader kind of downflow, sort of upstream effects of AI and chips. I think a lot of folks are also thinking about the supply chain issues and the industrial policy issues that then flow from AI policy as well.
yeah. Yeah.
So it's a complex space, right? And there are a lot of diverging views in that community, and it's not a sort of a homogenous view that I think perhaps is the misconception.
Yeah, and good point. And so, the big name in AI is Sam Altman. He's the founder of OpenAI, and he recently went out with this very utopian view of AI, its future, and it certainly is becoming ubiquitous. Like, I'm going to out myself here and say that I'm a bit of a late adopter of technology. I usually wait until something is kind of like tried and tested, and other people can show that it works. And I'm like, okay, fine, I'll try it, I'll learn it, whatever. But, even I've tried OpenAI or some of the different AI things. I've tried it. So I'm like, okay. So, but I feel like by the time I'm using something, it's fairly ubiquitous. I guess, and so it's a space where we're just seeing so much change happening so
Mm-hmm.
quickly. What do you think are like the opportunities and challenges we'll see in AI over the next 4 years, or really where is AI going to be going in kind of the near term that we need to be thinking about in terms of what's next?
Yeah. Well, it's a great, great topic and great time to be talking about this because the Stanford has just published these things called the digitalist papers. Now, I can't say
Wow.
that word. I'm going to try that again. Digitalist papers for those listening at home. And basically, it's sort of a rethink about how AI as a technology is going to impact society, right? And how we
Wow.
interact with AI. And I think a good way of thinking about AI is not necessarily as like augmented intelligence, but thinking about it as electricity, as something that everybody is going to have, ideally, and is going to really turbocharge every industry and every sort of profession.
Wow.
And so I've been on record saying that I am very much a tech optimist, and I think that AI is going to transform many aspects of science and also humanities.
Wow.
AI has incredible impacts. So just speaking about diplomacy, right? I think I'd spoken about this to our foreign ministry, DFAT, a couple of weeks ago on what emerging technologies like AI can do
Wow.
for the practice of diplomacy. None of
Wow.
this is really going to sort of replace diplomacy, the art of diplomacy, but it can help to make it more of a science. So what that
Wow.
means is, using like sort of substituting or sort of supporting the need for live language interpreters and using automated language processing that could help negotiations, or sort
Wow.
of using some tools to speed up negotiations and help diplomats be more informed ahead of multilateral talks. And thinking about using AI to summarize and search huge informations of data information more quickly than a team of humans. So that's
Okay.
just a few of those things. But if you think about what AI can do for transforming science and sort of accelerating the rate of science and research. It's something that I don't think we've seen. You know, people always say compare AI to the last industrial revolution, but I really do think that it is that. And within sort of within society, I think within government and democracies, we can really rethink the way that AI can help citizens re-engage with democracy. But I know that sounds all very pie in the sky. So for those who are skeptical, please take a look at the due diligence papers. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas in there that sort of challenge these notions. But I think regardless, we can't think about AI as something that is going to be that's going to be in the future, because obviously we've been working with AI for many years. I think the most commonly used example of this is the autocomplete function, in Google search when you're using that term and it comes up. But I think what we're moving towards, of course, is this idea of agentic AI. So AI being a sentient thing that's able to sort of have its own capabilities to learn new things and self-correct. And that's not based on sort of large language models that are already programmed in for machine learning. So I think that's where things are, I think, speeding towards here, and the sort of impact of that on existing sciences and industries, whether that's in edtech, whether that's in finance industry, or sort of energy efficiencies, is really, really interesting, I think.
And that feels like it would be almost a quantum leap in terms of from the large language models too. If it can be really like learning beyond like the LLMs, it's very much stuck on the programming that's put into it and that's driving behind it.
Exactly. And the data that's already there.
If it can break outside of that mold to be learning and growing beyond that feels like it would just be, I don't even know if exponential is the right word, but just an absolutely massive
like a hockey stick, right? I
think exactly. Exactly. The last question I want to touch on before I get you by the numbers stat is just thinking then about the US presidential race. It is going to be incredibly close. I mean, the polls are just tightening. Almost all of them are within the margin of error. It's going to come down to a few swing states and just, thousands of votes in those few swing states. And in 2020, the, disinformation that we saw in the period while we were waiting for the election results. So like the polls closed, but, in some states, the, absentee ballots weren't counted until afterwards. So we saw numbers shift and change. The disinformation then just seemed to amplify dramatically and fuel the movement that then ended up leading to the Capitol riots on January 6th. Do you think we should be bracing ourselves for something similar this time around if the polls are that close? And what role do you think disinformation might play in that post-election pre-inauguration period?
I mean, only a fool will be able to tell you exactly what will happen during the election. I think but if anyone pretends that they know, I think they're either telling a lie or sort of a little bit deluded. I think at this point it's too close to tell, as you've said, rightly. And look, similar to 2020, I really think that disinformation is going to play a huge role in the reception of the results, post-elections. But the good thing is, and I think the key differentiator here is that the FBI and other sort of domestic security forces are well prepared to respond to this time. You would think. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C., so I am very much either praying for that or getting out of the country during that week in case anything goes awry. But I think that there's disinformation is probably going to proliferate on these closed wall communities, I say, or closed gardens of information regardless. And whatever, in terms of inoculation that can come from up top is going to happen. But I think the problem with a lot of these closed gardens is that the folks who are already there don't believe what is coming in from the outside. And so it's very, very difficult to pop that sort of epistemic bubble or echo chamber of information. So I think in terms of preparing for it, there is on the other end of the response, there's a lot more punitive measures for those who are trying to bring together an insurrection 2.0 or sort of push back on the results. But we'll see. I think disinformation is, again, very much a a tool that is being used in the broader election cycle from, as we've seen from foreign actors as well as domestic actors. But I think that everybody's a lot more better inoculated towards it this time around.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'll be interested to see how it plays out, and we'll all be kind of waiting with bated breath to see what comes. But thank you for taking us through, everything from AI and the campaign, the threats, the opportunities, all of this. It's been fascinating. So I guess the last thing I'd love to get is your by the numbers stat on this topic. What do you have for us?
Sure. I have a number 160.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is, the number 160%. So what that is the rate at which data center power demand is going to grow by 2030.
Oh, wow.
So right now, and that's all thanks to AI, because, if we do a search term and you do a sort of regular search term compared to an AI power term, that requires 10x the amount of energy. And so data centers and the energy problem that is posed because of AI is something that I think a lot of folks, a lot of governments certainly are struggling with. I think here in DC, there's a lot of policymakers thinking about that now. But I mean, at present, to give you an idea, in the US, data centers worldwide consume 1% to 2% of overall power. But this percentage is going to increase to 3% to 4% by the end of the decade. So just by this decade, right? And data centers currently use about 3% of the total US power as of 2022. And then by 2030, it's going to be almost 10% of US power.
Wow.
So that's a lot. I think the electric grid is really not prepared for this surge of power that's going to be needed. And there's not really an easy fix, because I think as we're seeing this guy kind of like I'm doing things with my arms that Mara can see and folks at home can't see. But, the sort of efficiency, the gains for improving on the way that we can capitalize on energy is decreasing, whereas the need for energy is increasing thanks to AI. So I think this is a number that I think about a lot, because I don't have any easy answers to it. And I hope that there are people smarter than me who are thinking about this.
Well, that's fascinating.
Well, I know that there are folks smarter than me thinking about this, so that's good.
Yeah.
This is a number, by the way, I should credit it. It's from Goldman Sachs from May this year.
Well, great. That is a really compelling statistic, because we think about chips and the role that they play in technology, where it's like, okay, we've got this physical component or this physical limitation that drives technology and technological growth. But it's like, and as we're grappling with the energy transition, we've got this thing that's going to be fueling the demand needing to increase so much. And so it adds that extra pressure on the transition.
That's right.
And just making sure you've got enough capacity to deal with this, the innovation, the new technology, and what it's going to need. That's fascinating. So as we wrap up, I would like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our listeners. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co-host of Asia Chessboard podcast with Jude Blanchette, the Freeman Chair for China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our 2024 Election Watch series. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you liked our conversation today, please make sure to check out the Intrigue Explained podcast featuring Helen. It's really a great listen. I can't recommend it highly enough, and you can find that wherever you find your podcast. Once again, Helen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lauren.